They called his radio a pile of junk, rusted wires cluttering up valuable land. The developers stood in Henry's shack, their polished shoes scuffing the warped wooden floor, their voices cutting through the hum of ancient radio equipment. "Time to move on, old man," one said, smirking at the tangle of antennas outside. "Progress waits for no one." Henry, 85, stood by his workbench, clutching a battered microphone, its faded U.S. Army emblem worn smooth under his thumb. The air was thick with the scent of hot dust and ozone, and the faint crackle of radio waves filled the silence. He thought of his grandchildren, their faces blurred by years of absence. No one saw the quiet fire in his eyes. But a storm was coming and it would change everything. Henry's shack sat on the edge of Dust Bowl, Nevada, a speck of a town where tumbleweeds outnumbered people. The desert stretched endlessly around it, a sea of cracked earth and sagebrush under a sky that burned orange at dusk. His radio station, K7HNR, was no more than a sagging wooden hut, its walls papered with yellowed maps and frequency charts. Inside, shelves groaned under the weight of vacuum tube receivers, their dials glowing faintly in the dim light of a single bulb. The air was dry, heavy with the tang of heated metal. At night, coyotes yipped in the distance, their calls blending with the static that hissed from Henry's speakers. He'd built this place himself decades ago when the world felt bigger and his son was still alive. Henry was a Korean War veteran, though he never spoke of it. His past lived in small things, a scratched army watch on his wrist ticking softly, a faded anchor tattoo on his forearm from his days as a Navy radioman, a photo of his old unit, tucked in a drawer beneath a pile of logbooks. He'd been 20 then, hunched over a radio in a frozen tent, relaying coordinates through the chaos of war. His voice had saved lives, though he'd never say so. Now, at 85, his shoulders stooped, and his hands trembled slightly, but his fingers still danced over dials with a precision that belied his age. He was quiet, his words sparse, his dignity worn like an old coat, comfortable, unassuming but heavy with history. The developers had come that morning, 2 men in crisp shirts, their SUV glinting in the desert sun. They wanted his land for a strip mall, a commercial opportunity to revitalize Dust Bowl. They laughed at his radios, calling them relics, and at him, calling him a hermit. "What's the point of this hobby, Henry?" the younger one, Travis, had asked, leaning against a shelf and knocking over a stack of QSL cards. "You're out here talking to nobody." Henry didn't answer. He just adjusted a knob, coaxing a faint signal from the static. The developers didn't know he'd once coordinated air support under enemy fire, his voice steady as shells fell. They didn't care. To them, he was just an old man in the way. Henry's loneliness wasn't new, but it had deepened since his son, Michael, died 10 years ago. Michael's kids, Henry's grandchildren, lived in Reno, but their visits had stopped after the funeral. He didn't blame them. Life moved on and he was just a voice from a forgotten time. Still, he kept their old drawings pinned to the wall, crayon scribbles of radios and stars. Every night, he broadcasted on the ham bands, sending his call sign into the ether. "K7HNR, K7HNR, this is Henry in Dust Bowl, Nevada. Anyone out there?" Sometimes truckers answered, or hobbyists from Japan, their voices crackling through the night. Mostly it was silence. But Henry kept talking because the airwaves felt like home. The developer's visit left a bitter taste. They'd left a contract on his table, a pen lying across it like a challenge. "Sell or we'll make things difficult," they'd implied. Henry sat in his creaking chair, the bulb above casting shadows across his face. He picked up the microphone, his voice low. "K7HNR, Dust Bowl, Nevada. Anyone copy?" No reply. The coyotes howled and the wind rattled the shack's loose shingles. He thought of Michael, of the way his son used to sit here wide-eyed as Henry taught him Morse code. The memory stung. He set the mic down, his hand lingering on it. Days passed and the desert heat grew fiercer. Dust Bowl buzzed with rumors of the developers' plans. A shopping center, maybe a casino. The town's diner, where Henry sometimes ate, hummed with talk of jobs and progress. "Henry's gotta sell," said Clara, the waitress, pouring coffee. "Can't stop the future." Henry sipped his coffee, saying nothing. His silence wasn't weakness, it was the weight of a man who'd seen too much to argue with fools. At night, he'd return to his shack, the air thick with static and the smell of warm electronics. He'd tune the bands, searching for voices, for connection. "K7H, anyone out there?" he'd say, his voice steady like it was 1952 again, and he was calling for a medevac in a snowstorm. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the shack's window with streaks of gold, Henry found a signal. A faint voice, garbled but urgent, broke through the static. "Mayday, lost, Canyon?" Henry leaned forward, his heart quickening. He adjusted the dial, his fingers steady despite the tremor in his hands. The voice came clearer. A hiker, part of a tour group, stranded in Red Rock Canyon 30 miles out. A wildfire had sparked, cutting them off. The signal was weak, their radio dying. Henry's shack, with its jury-rigged antennas, was their only lifeline. He didn't hesitate. His voice, calm and precise, cut through the static. "This is K7HNR, Dust Bowl, Nevada. I copy your mayday. Give me your coordinates." The hiker's voice shook, but Henry guided them, asking for landmarks, signal strength, anything to pinpoint their location. His mind flashed back to Korea, the cold, the fear, the need to be the steady hand in the dark. He scribbled notes on a pad, his army watch glinting under the bulb. Outside, the wind howled, carrying the faint smell of smoke. The fire was spreading. Henry patched through to the county's emergency frequency, relaying the hiker's position. His equipment, mocked as junk, hummed with purpose. He spoke in clipped tones, the way he had in the war, passing coordinates to a dispatcher who sounded surprised to hear a civilian on the line. "Stay on this frequency," Henry said to the hikers. "I'm with you." For hours he sat there, his back aching, his eyes burning, talking to the stranded group. He told them to stay low, to cover their faces, to wait for the choppers. His voice was their anchor. By dawn, the rescue was underway. Henry heard the chopper blades over the radio, the hikers' voices breaking with relief. "We're safe," one said. "Thank you, Henry." He leaned back, the microphone heavy in his hand. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened, just for a moment. The shack was quiet again, save for the crackle of static and the distant yip of a coyote. He didn't know that one of the rescuers, a young volunteer named Sarah, had heard his transmission and wondered who this man was, this voice in the desert who'd saved lives. Sarah was 24, a paramedic with a knack for radios, volunteering with Dust Bowl's fire crew. She'd caught Henry's signal by chance, monitoring the emergency bands. His calm, his precision, it reminded her of her grandfather, a Vietnam vet who'd taught her to respect the airwaves. After the rescue, she drove to Henry's shack, her pickup kicking up dust on the dirt road. The shack looked like it might collapse under the next gust, its antennas leaning like old trees. She knocked, and Henry opened the door, his eyes wary. "You're K7HNR, she said, not a question. Henry nodded, wiping his hands on a rag. "Heard you last night. You saved those people." Henry shrugged, his voice low. "Just doing what I know." Sarah stepped inside, her eyes scanning the cluttered shelves, the glowing dials. She noticed the photo in the open drawer. Young men in uniforms, Henry among them, grinning in a way she couldn't imagine him doing now. "You were a radio man," she said, piecing it together. Henry didn't answer, but his silence told her enough. Sarah left, but she couldn't shake the image of Henry alone in that shack, his voice carrying through the night. She started asking around Dust Bowl, digging into his story. Clara at the diner mentioned Henry's son, his grandchildren. The town librarian found an old article about Henry's unit, how his radio work had saved a platoon in '52. Sarah found a medal too, tucked in a box at the Historical Society. A bronze star, Henry's name engraved on it. The developers' voices echoed in her mind, their mockery of his useless hobby. She felt a spark of anger, then resolve. The developers returned a week later, their contract thicker, their smiles colder. "Last chance, Henry," Travis said, tossing a pen onto the table. "This town's moving forward, with or without you." Henry stood by his radio, tuning out their voices. The air smelled of dust and solder, the bulb flickering above. He thought of the hikers, of his son, of the grandchildren he hadn't seen in years. He thought of Korea, the nights when his voice was the difference between life and death. He didn't sign. That night, Sarah posted about Henry on X, her words simple but sharp. "Met a hero today. Henry, K7HNR, saved lives with his radio. Korean War vet, still serving. Dust Bowl, don't let his story fade." She attached a photo of the bronze star. The post spread, likes and retweets piling up. By morning, Dust Bowl was buzzing again, but this time it wasn't about strip malls. People whispered about Henry, about the medal, about the hikers. Clara poured his coffee for free, her eyes soft. "Didn't know Henry," she said. He nodded, saying nothing. Sarah wasn't done. She drove to the town hall, the medal in her pocket, and asked for a moment at the next meeting. She wanted to tell Henry's story, to make the developers see him, to make the town remember. But the fire hadn't stopped, and neither had the developers' plans. Henry's shack, his radios, his life, they hung in the balance. And somewhere in Reno, two kids saw Sarah's post, their grandfather's name glowing on their phone screens. They looked at each other, wondering if it was time to drive to Dust Bowl. Henry sat in his shack, the microphone in his hand. K7H&R, Dust Bowl, Nevada. Anyone copy? The static answered, but he felt a shift, a ripple in the air. The coyotes were quiet tonight, and the desert sky burned with stars. He didn't know what was coming, but for the first time in years he felt seen. The storm wasn't over, but his voice still carried, steady and unbroken, into the night. To be continued? Inspired by Henry's story? Subscribe to Hoffman Stories for more tales of quiet heroism and the power of kindness. Let's honor the unseen heroes in our communities. The desert sky over Dust Bowl blazed with stars, and Henry's shack hummed with the soft crackle of radio waves. He sat at his workbench, the microphone heavy in his hand like a memory. K7H&R, Dust Bowl, Nevada. Anyone copy? His voice was calm, but it carried a new note, faint as the rustle of sagebrush in the wind. Sarah's post on X had spread through the town, and Dust Bowl began to whisper about the old veteran, his medal, his radio. But the developers didn't back down, their plans for a strip mall threatening to sweep Henry's shack away like a sand dune. And somewhere in Reno, two grandchildren, Emma and Jake, stared at their grandfather's name on their phone screens, feeling a pull to return. Henry didn't know about Sarah's post, but he sensed a change. People at the diner looked at him differently. Clara, pouring his coffee, lingered, her smile softer. "You're a hero, Henry," she said one morning, setting a plate of eggs before him. He shrugged, his fingers tightening around his worn army watch. "Did what I had to," he replied, his voice lost in the hum of the diner's fan. But Clara's words stirred something in him, something long buried, like an old signal breaking through the static. Sarah didn't sit idle. She returned to Henry's shack a few days after the hiker's rescue, this time with a laptop and a stack of yellowed papers she dug up from the Historical Society's archives. "Henry, I found something," she said, her eyes bright. She placed an old radio logbook before him, its pages filled with Henry's neat handwriting from 1952. Records of coordinates, call signs, brief notes, saved 12/347. Henry ran his finger over the page, his eyes narrowing. He hadn't seen this log in decades. "Where'd you get this?" he asked, his voice low but taut. Sarah told him about the library, the Bronze Star, the article describing how he'd saved a platoon by relaying messages under fire. Henry fell silent, his hand trembling over the log. She didn't stop there. Sarah planned to speak at the town meeting, set for 2 days later. The developers were pressuring the town council, demanding approval to demolish Henry's shack. She wanted to tell his story, show the medal, make the town remember who he was. But Dust Bowl was divided. Some saw jobs and prosperity in the developers' plans, others saw the loss of a humble shack that was more than a home to Henry, it was his life. Sarah knew the fight for Henry's shack would be tough, but she believed his story could change everything. That night, Henry sat at his radio tuning the bands. He hadn't heard about Sarah's plans, but his thoughts were restless. The developers had returned that day, their tone sharper. "This is your last offer, Henry," Travis had said, his eyes glinting with malice. "The town won't wait forever." Henry didn't respond, just turned back to his radios. After they left, he keyed the mic, his voice cutting through the ether. "K7H&R, Dust Bowl, Nevada." A reply came from Japan, a ham operator in Tokyo. "Good signal, Henry-san," the voice said. Henry smiled barely. The airwaves never let him down. The next day, Sarah returned with a plan. "Henry, will you come with me to the meeting?" she asked. He shook his head. "Don't like crowds." But she pressed, her voice soft but firm. "You don't have to speak. Just be there." Henry looked at her earnest eyes, and something in him stirred. He nodded. The town meeting took place in the stifling town hall, smelling of old wood and coffee. People murmured, chairs creaked, the air conditioner struggled against the heat. The developers stood at the front, their slides showing a gleaming strip mall with neon signs. Travis spoke of Dust Bowl's future, of jobs, of progress. Henry sat in the back row, his hands resting on his knees, eyes downcast. Sarah, clutching the medal and logbook, waited her turn. When she was called, she stepped to the podium, her voice clear though trembling with nerves. "This is about Henry Thompson," she began, holding up the Bronze Star. The room fell silent. She told of the Korean War, the saved platoon, the hikers in the canyon. She read from the logbook, 219 SOS relayed, saved 8. Her voice grew stronger. "Henry's not just an old man with a radio. He's a hero. And his home isn't junk. It's the heart of Dust Bowl." She turned to Henry, her eyes shining. "Thank you, Henry." The room erupted in applause. Henry sat still, his fingers tightening on his watch. He didn't look up, but he felt the weight of their gazes. Travis tried to object, calling the radio station outdated, but his words drowned in the crowd's murmurs of disapproval. The mayor, an old man with tired eyes, raised a hand for silence. "We'll consider it," he said. But Henry knew, this wasn't victory yet. That night, back in his shack, Henry heard a knock. He expected Sarah, maybe the developers, but instead saw two teenagers, a girl with pigtails and a boy with a backpack. Emma and Jake, his grandchildren. Their eyes were wide, nervous, but hopeful. "Grandpa," Emma said, her voice shaking. Henry froze. He hadn't seen them in 5 years. His hand trembled as he invited them inside. They sat in the cramped shack, the smell of hot dust mingling with the coffee Henry put on the stove. Emma told him how she'd seen Sarah's post, how she and Jake decided to come. "We didn't know," she said, her eyes glistening with tears. "About all this. About you." Jake, quiet, held one of Henry's old microphones, his fingers tracing the faded emblem. Henry told them about the radio, the war, their father. His voice was low but steady, like a signal cutting through a storm. They listened, and for the first time in years the shack didn't feel so empty. A week later, the town council voted against demolishing Henry's shack. Sarah's post, the community's support, and Henry's heroism tipped the scales. The developers backed off, their plans redrawn to spare the radio station. But Dust Bowl went further. Sarah organized volunteers to modernize K7HNR, adding new antennas and a digital receiver while preserving Henry's old tube radios. The local park was named Henry Thompson Park, with a small plaque in his honor, for Henry Thompson, K7HNR Korean War hero and Dust Bowl's voice. On the final evening, as volunteers finished their work, Henry stood outside, looking at the new antenna gleaming under the stars. Emma and Jake were beside him, holding a box of his old QSL cards. He took the microphone, his fingers gripping it firmly. "K7HNR Dust Bowl, Nevada," he said, and this time replies came quickly, a voice from Canada, then Australia. Henry smiled, faintly, his eyes calm. The community changed. They started an annual radio festival in the park, where kids learned Morse code, and adults listened to Henry's stories. His voice, once forgotten, became Dust Bowl's heart. Sarah, now a close friend, often stopped by with coffee and new ideas for the station. And Emma and Jake became part of his life, their visits filling the shack with laughter. Henry didn't seek glory. He just did what he knew. But Sarah's small gesture, her post, her words at the meeting, restored his dignity, reminding the town of the value of quiet heroes. His shack, once called junk, became a beacon and his voice a legend. Inspired by Henry's story? Subscribe to Hoffman Stories for more tales of quiet heroism and the power of kindness. Let's honor the unseen heroes in our communities. Respect for veterans is respect for our history.